Hello everybody and welcome again to the Paleoconnection. Today me and Verv are going to be doing something a little bit different, as we are going to be discussing and analyzing another YouTube video which is called Quantum Physics Debunks Materialism. Now this video will be linked in the description of our video, and I encourage everybody to actually watch this video first in entirety before you actually watch our video. But we will also have clips of that video embedded into our video at important points. Now, what we are going to be discussing then is something quite deep, something that me and Verv certainly aren't, experts on. So I would like you guys to bear with us on this, as we're kind of just two normal guys giving our opinions on this deep issue. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is what exactly is materialism. So materialism is the belief that all that exists is matter and energy, and the rearrangements of it. So it's sort of an extreme view of realism, and it states that physical reality exists independent of observation. So since materialism is a philosophical system which regards matter as the only reality in the world, it therefore denies the existence of God and the soul, and things like a separate consciousness and anything that is immaterial. So because of this, materialism cannot be perceived as compatible with modern world religions that most often describe and they ascribe existence to immaterial objects, as I said before, like the soul or consciousness. Materialism is also typically conflated with atheism, and many scientists are materialists these days, and other famous people that are in the news like Sam Harris, he is also a materialist. It's been quite popular since about the mid-18th century, and it is still, very dominant today with the new atheist crowd in particular. One of the problems, though, was the advent of quantum mechanics, and that has quite shaken the beliefs of materialism, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. The reason for this is that matter, which was thought to be tiny particles that exist independent of observation, this seems to not actually be true in the quantum world. So one of the biggest conundrums that is presented to the materialist worldview is something called the double-slit experiment. Now I'm going to briefly describe what it is, but I'm also going to have a video clip after this that you will watch, and I think by watching the video clip you will get a better understanding, because it is quite complicated and difficult to just explain through words, but I'll attempt to do it first. So the double-slit experiment is in the basic version of it, there's many different versions of it. There is a coherent light source, such as like a laser beam, and it illuminates a plate pierced by two parallel slits. So there's two slits side by side. And the light passing through the slits is observed on a screen behind the plate. So there's a screen that is placed behind the plate. The plate itself has two small slits, and then there is a laser or light that is shined through those slits. So the wave nature of light causes the light waves passing through the two slits to interfere, which produces bright and dark bands on the screen that is behind the slits. A result that would not be expected if light consisted of classical particles. So we think of light as particles, right? But what happens is there is an interference pattern or a wave pattern that ends up being shown on the screen behind it. Okay. To go on, it says, however, the light is always found to be absorbed at the screen at discrete points as individual particles, not waves. The interference pattern appears via the varying density of these particles hit on the screen. Furthermore, versions of the experiment that include detectors at the slits find that each detected photon passes through one slit and not through both slits. So the point here is what you're going to see in the video afterwards is that there is photons that are shot through these two slits side by side. When these slits are not observed through a measuring instrument, those slits form a wave pattern on the screen behind it. Okay, but when there is an observer present, or some sort of camera or something that is observing, some sort of measurement device, as soon as that measurement device is put by the slits, suddenly those photons pass through the double slits as particles. Okay, so what it's saying there is that the wave function changes to a particle only if there is an observer present. Okay, so let's go ahead to the first video clip now.
Experiment showed, a simple explanation is given. Subatomic particles were thought to exist like tiny bits of matter, not like continuous waves of energy. However, sending electrons through a double slit showed they acted like waves of energy instead of tiny bits of matter. Even sending one electron through at a time, the same results happened. However, when one set up a measuring device at one slit, the results changed, and the electrons acted as one would expect, as tiny bits and not spread out waves.
When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched.
Okay, Verv, so let's bring you in on this. After watching that clip, what are your initial thoughts?
Well, it's honestly very amazing because it definitely goes against what we would expect to happen, being that we would think that when we are watching something or when we're not watching something, the exact same results would occur. So it's very surprising to me, as I'm sure it's surprising to everybody else.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think we just have this intuition that, of course, if we're not observing things, if we're not, directly looking at something, of course, it doesn't really matter, right? The world is, playing out regardless. Or, of course, these quantum materials are just, in their states, and they are existing regardless of whether we are looking at them. But according to this double slit experiment, the observation of the individual actually gives life almost to these particles, right? These particles do not exist as they are before we observe them. They are just a what's called a wave function, which is essentially like it's like a mathematical term that describes all possible positions of the particle, but you cannot actually point to the particle in a specific position without actually observing it. So it's very non-intuitive, and this is the experiment that sort of kind of broke quantum mechanics and is the thing that is a serious problem for materialism, which we will continue to talk about later on in this video. Any other thoughts about that, Verv, before we move on?
None right now.
Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the second clip.
Who deserves to trust their intuition more than Einstein? And Einstein's intuition told him, like everybody's intuition tells them, that things are really there when you're not looking at them. Well, he was wrong, right? That intuition is incorrect.
Okay, welcome back. So that small clip, basically the main point there that I thought is just amazing is that this professor from MIT is saying that, things are not really there if you are not looking at them, right? So this is something that is just kind of mind-blowing, right? Like we said before with the double slit experiment, we have this intuition that, of course, things exist, even if we are not there to observe them. But in the quantum world, this does not seem to be the case. What do you think about this, Verv? What do you think the repercussions are for this as well?
Well, it's certainly very interesting. It immediately reminded me of the philosopher George Berkeley, who I believe is, I want to say 17th century, but I don't know offhand. But he brought forward this idea that maybe God has to continuously observe the entirety of the world in order for it to actively be there, and that things don't exist when you look away from them. This, of course, was something that he didn't know quantum mechanics, right? It was some conclusion he came to through a very different means, and it really seemed like one of the most outlandish possible ways of proving God. And yet, here we are in the 21st century, and kind of this very forgettable proof of God that was kind of based off of the seemingly ephemeral reality of things, and whether or not a tree in the forest makes a sound if it falls. This kind of forgettable proof now seems more relevant than ever.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting that you say that, because in our last clip, we will show a clip of Michio Kaku, who is, the famous Japanese-American physicist, and he describes the exact same thing that you just said. And we will show that in a clip and speak about it more specifically. But yes, that idea of we cannot even exist, nothing can exist if God is not actually observing us, or what we call God, or the ultimate consciousness, whatever you want to call God. If he is not observing us in whatever way he does that, then yes, we would not exist. So we'll kind of go into that in a bit more detail. Let's move on to the third clip now.
Another escape route many materialists use is to hold to the many world interpretations of quantum mechanics, which basically argues there is no collapse of the wave function upon measurement, but that every possibility splits off into different worlds. So every quantum probability actually does play out. They just split off into different worlds, and in each one I'm observing each different outcome. But it is riddled with problems, unlike the idealist understanding, and it is an apparent violation of Occam's razor, as entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity.
So as mentioned in the clip, one of the ways that a materialist, or someone who is trying to debunk the observational reality to the world, they might say that, well, there are many worlds that are the result of the observations of these particles. So for example, after the wave function collapses into a particle, and then we observe it, we are observing one possible result. And there are other possible results right during that observation that could have happened, or actually that did happen. But those branch off into separate worlds, right? Almost, so there's basically millions upon millions, and actually billions upon billions or trillions of, almost an infinite amount of worlds that end up resulting from all of these different possibilities that these particles would take. So as this video goes on to explain, and hopefully you watch the entire video, you'll see, is that this many worlds interpretation violates Occam's razor. Now, Occam's razor is just essentially the idea that a scientific and philosophical rule that states that entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily, right? So basically try to keep things simple. The best solution is usually the simple solution. And when we have to live in the reality where there's, trillions of different, worlds that have been created based on every possible decision that could have happened, it just doesn't seem practical, right? It doesn't really pass the sniff test, or it fails the test of Occam's razor. Thoughts on that?
It seems just so transparently stupid that the universe would exist in such a fashion where when some quantum mechanical event happens anywhere in the world, it necessitates for it to split into millions, potentially, of different universes. And now imagine how many quantum events are actually happening all the time, just between different phenomena of people, turning lights on and off and things like that. It would just literally be some kind of, it makes infinity seem like a small number, right? Because then you go into each one of these worlds where quantum mechanics continue to happen. There, someone runs a strobe light and, you've got an absurd amount of new worlds created. How this would even seem scientific seems absurd. It really just seems, to be quite frank, stupider than any kind of theological speculation you might get in, a religion you don't even subscribe to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it states it in this video, or it was another one that I watched too, that yes, there's trillions of atoms within our own bodies. So imagine all the different worlds would result just from the quantum events that are happening just in our bodies alone. And it just seems preposterous. And, as we said, it doesn't pass the Occam's razor test. So with that being said, let's go to our last and our longest clip.
Said, let's take it one step farther. If I, a human being, looks at the cat, I am conscious. Therefore, consciousness determines existence. At that point, Einstein went ballistic and said, what? You're saying that the fact that you are a conscious being determines the fact that the cat is alive? Answer is yes. And Wigner made one more step. And that is, how do I know I'm alive? You see, the cat and me, we're part of the same universe. If I don't know the cat is alive or dead, I could also be dead at the same time and not even know it. So who determines that I'm alive? Well, Wigner's friend looks at me, I look at the cat, and we exist. But then who looks at Wigner's friend? And there's an infinite chain of people looking at people, until finally you hit cosmic consciousness.
So yeah, the beginning of that clip is actually referencing the famous Schrodinger's cat experiment. And just to briefly describe that, so maybe you can understand what is said in the rest of that clip. Right, in the Schrodinger's cat experiment, right, there's a cat in a box, there's poison put in the box, there's like a Geiger counter and I think it's a uranium atom, and it's because of the unpredictability of the half-life of the atom, we can say we are unsure if the cat is alive or dead based on, if the poison was released or not because of the radioactive element decaying, which then would trigger the poison. So before we open the box, right, we cannot possibly be certain if the cat is dead or alive. We have to actually open the box and we have to actually observe. And then once we observe, then the cat is alive or dead. So what this clip is saying is that, so if we observe that the cat is, let's say, alive, well, we only know that because we observed it, right? So how do we then know that we are alive, right? Because the cat needed an observer to determine if it was alive. So then we also need observers to determine if we are alive. And then what that does is just creates this chain reaction, this never-ending chain reaction of, okay, I need an observer, right? So, Verv has to observe me to determine that I'm alive, and then he needs an observer. So, right, we can just pile this on forever until we get to the end, right? And the way it is described in this video is cosmic consciousness, right? But what is cosmic consciousness if it is not God? And this goes back to what Verv was talking about with, I believe you said Berkeley, George Berkeley, was it, the philosopher? In that
right. He
believed that the existence of all of us, it requires God's observation of us, which, I don't know, what was that, 100, 200 years ago that he said this?
It would have been the early to mid 18th century.
Yeah, and here we have a modern physicist, and this is the general belief based on quantum mechanics that this is an actual requirement, right? We cannot be certain that something exists unless there is an observer. So there must be some sort of observer, right, that is actually outside of the world too, right? The cosmic consciousness or God, that he is looking down, right? Of course, not physically looking down, right? But in whatever God's way that he does this, he would be observing us and therefore giving us life. And I believe that this also, kind of to tie it in with Christianity, I believe this goes that you can find verses in the Bible that prove that this sort of thing is actually what the Bible says, right? That, God is, without God observing us, we cannot exist. What do you think about that, Verv? Very deep.
It is. And yeah, it seems like it is something that if you didn't really know about quantum mechanics, you would not really come to this conclusion. It's so counterintuitive because we've had plenty of experiences where our back is to something, but then we turn around and it's obviously there, and things behind us continue to happen. We don't necessarily think that anything behind us disappears. So it just seems like it's so jarringly inconsistent, and we're just naturally siding with Einstein here. No one really could have expected these kinds of results. It's something that I'm almost, because the science now says that this is the case, I'm forced to believe it. But even still, it seems like something I don't want to necessarily accept. And I'm a theist.
Yeah, one of the things that also makes this interesting, too, is that I heard an interesting thought about it, and that was that, we have the universe. The universe is so huge, right? We talk about how large space is all the time. But the fact that, so we haven't observed, 99.999% of the universe, right? It's never been actually observed. Therefore, that would assume then that, 99.999% of the universe therefore exists in a wave function. It does not actually exist yet because there has been nothing to observe it. So that really blows your mind when you think of it, because then that means that, well, the universe, which we think is so big, actually might not be, right? It's only as big as we can perceive it, right? Perhaps people who did live thousands of years ago that only were able to perceive the universe from Earth and look up at the stars, their universe was actually smaller in a way. They did not observe the rest of it. There was no observer, so it did not actually come into existence until later on, the 20th century and whatnot. We've explored space, and now we have actually sort of expanded the universe just by observing it.
Because it just exists as light in the sky for such a long period of time.
Yeah. And then one other thing I'd like to say before we finish up, too, one of the common theories these days that you hear is simulation theory, and it seems to be becoming very popular. I think people like Elon Musk, I think he's pretty much bought into it, right? And that's the idea that we live in a simulation. And I think it's become very popular these days because we've seen the power of computing. And the interesting thing is that this theory with quantum physics does actually lend credence to that simulation theory, but not completely, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But the fact that, games, like when you're playing a game on your computer, right, the graphics card is only, rendering the world that you need to see, right? So you have this huge world that is you could potentially explore in your game, but it would require too much computing power to render all of that at once, right? So only the part that you are directly observing is rendered, and the stuff that you have not reached yet in the game, or the stuff that's behind you, isn't rendered until you actually look back at it. So that kind of thing does actually match with quantum physics. But the problem with it is the fact that if we are living in a simulation, and that is true, that would mean there are some sort of alien species, or perhaps some sort of futuristic humans are, that have created this simulation, right? So we are in a simulation, and therefore, if this is not the real world, this is the simulation, then perhaps they live in the real world. So you still have not explained their world, right? So you've only explained our world. There must be a quote-unquote real world on top of the simulation, right? And even if you say, okay, we live in a simulation, and the people who simulated us also live in a simulation, and it's just like simulations all the way down, well, again, there still has to be something what we would call the real world, and that must be explained. So conscious observer, or God, even in a simulated world, seems to be the best explanation, right? Because God could actually exist outside of what you would say the real world is. So that would be the only way that we could get all of these simulations in the first place, is if there is somebody that is outside of the real world, wherever that might be, a million layers down or whatnot. So it is interesting to think about the simulation theory, because it does fit in well with quantum physics, but in the end it ultimately fails. And if you are more interested in learning about that, I highly suggest that you look at Inspiring Philosophy, who is the creator of the Quantum Physics Debunks Materialism video that we are talking about. He also explains in detail why simulation theory just doesn't cut it. Verv, what would you like to say?
There's also some other interesting ways to look at this, perhaps. One of the things people say is that if God is able to know right from wrong, why doesn't he just simulate? Basically, why doesn't he just simulate the entire world, and all the people who are destined for hell don't really exist? All the people destined for heaven do actually exist. You come up with interesting theories like that. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was the concept that perhaps time is really only something that properly exists to us finite creatures. To somebody who is infinite like God, everything happens just immediately and at once. He exists in a point outside of time. So the moment that we are sharing right now was simultaneously occurring for him as a moment from 1,000 years from now, and as the moment that the whole universe came into existence. So in a sense, we would now no longer really think of time as something that exists objectively, but rather it is an element of simply our existence as created beings. So in a real sense, you could then say that, perhaps time is a simulated element, and we are, in some sense, inside of a simulation. There's a lot more other ideas you can throw in with this, and it's really just this wide open-ended thing. So that's, my last thoughts on simulation. But to throw in something else, there's lots of parts in the Bible, as we hinted upon earlier, where they talk about God observing absolutely everything. The most clear examples in Proverbs 15:3, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. And at many points in Psalms, it talks about the absurdity of trying to basically hide from God. And God observes essentially everything and is omniscient, and there's no place for anyone to hide from him. So if you look at the Bible, this concept of God as omniscient and observing everything is absolutely true. And, while it doesn't necessarily come to this exact theory where, God must observe the world or it does not exist, you can clearly see the concept of God's omniscience and constant looking upon everything is also there. And even more abstract ideas of God flowing through everything via the Holy Spirit. So it's not a concept alien to the Bible at all, that God is observant of everything and with us in everything. Do you have any more thoughts on that, Brand?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that the idea that a conscious observer creates the existence of physical objects, as the double-slit experiment seems to show, as you said, very much fits in with the Christian worldview and the Christian description of God. right? God speaks, basically, or thinks, or observe, and then things are created, right? The earth, animals, humans. So what we have here with the idea that conscious observers create the existence of physical objects, what we have here is the fact that the things must start, therefore, with a conscious observer, right? So if all physical objects are created by conscious observers, how could we have any physical objects, meaning the entire universe, if there is not already a conscious observer that has observed and created or made those physical objects come into existence? And, as you said, this is exactly what we say happens in Christianity. God speaks, and things are created. And what other way would you, create things if, according to the double-slit experiment, there is no conscious observer? So I think things very much fit in with the Christian worldview on this, and I highly encourage all of you to look further into this. Of course, this is just our take on it. As I said, we are certainly not experts. There are many other experts that know a lot more than we do about this particular subject, so I highly encourage you to go seek those out. So with that being said, I think we will end this episode. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Leave a comment if you would like to speak with us about this topic or any other, and we will see you guys next time on the Paleoconnection.